Hola, bienvenidos a todos una vez más desde el Swan de Lugo, desde nuestra nueva sección, bueno, nueva sección de entrevistas, The Italian Job. Aquí hoy tenemos un placer muy grande, un verdadero honor para tener al profesor Jason Brennan. Creo que vosotros todos lo conoceráis después de su libro En Contra de la Democracia que publicó en 2016. Él es un filósofo estadounidense de liberal clásico y que habla sobre pues, teoría de la democracia, ética del voto, cuestiones acerca de la moralidad del libre mercado, y es de verdad un verdadero honor para nosotros tenerle. Thank you very much, Professor Brennan, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. I still remember enough Spanish that I could understand everything you said, but I wouldn't be able to repeat it back to you probably.
Great, great. I was wondering, before we start with the more technical parts of the state in regards to democracy and your contributions, how did you come about? Uh, First of all, how did you become interested in philosophy and these sort of difficult topics? And second of all, your approximation to classical liberalism, libertarianism, and the like, so to speak.
Thanks. I think for me, the interest in philosophy began around the beginning of high school. I had a history teacher. You were learning European and world history, and she really pushed the idea that ideas move the world, that big political movements and so on are based upon big political ideas. So just out of curiosity, I decided to get a book by John Locke on his treatise on government and Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, because I thought here are two big ideas that help explain a lot of what happened in the Cold War ultimately. And so I started reading there. And I don't know if I really believe the thesis that she had, that ideas are moving history, quite as much as I might have back then. But that really was the introduction to me. I became interested in political philosophy because of that, and philosophy more general as a result.
Interesting. And then from there, it became, so to speak, a evolutionary process, I guess.
Yeah, I wasn't originally in college. I wasn't originally a philosophy major. I was majoring in economics and chemistry. And then I just one point, I remember I was like packing up my room, and I looked and I realized I had all these philosophy books, even though I hadn't been taking philosophy classes. I was just reading it for the heck of it. And I decided to look into what does it take to actually become a professional philosopher, like a philosophy professor. I realized that you get to go to grad school for free. They actually pay you to go. So that meant I could afford to do it. So I just made this decision that was what I was going to do, like right then and there. But it was like literally in the midst of packing up my room in a fraternity house.
and because it's I find it interesting that most philosophers, unfortunately, in my opinion, so I am in economics. I'm doing a PhD in economics. I'm interested in philosophy. I'm not my expertise, so to speak, is in economics. But but nevertheless, I think it's very important to have some background in philosophy, and maybe it's even more important than economics. But what I find interesting about your work is that, unlike, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of philosophers, you stress the importance of knowing other things aside from philosophy, and actually that influence your philosophical views, like economics, for example. Why do you believe that? And
Yeah, I'll tell you a story that I think illustrates that point. I was giving a talk on one of my books called Why Not Capitalism at the American Philosophical Association meeting. Maybe, I don't know if this is 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, but it was a while back. And I mentioned in the book that even though I'm debating, during the talk, I mentioned I'm debating this Marxist philosopher named Jerry Cohen, that Cohen, despite being a Marxist, he accepts and understands something called the calculation problem of socialism, that genuinely socialist economies can't make smart or rational economic decisions because they don't have a proxy for a price mechanism that tells them about relative scarcity and relative demand. So I mentioned that, and a student raised his hand and he asked a question, and he said, I'm writing my dissertation on the topic of why firms exist and whether firms are good or bad, whether employment is good or bad, whether we should all be independent contractors. And I wonder if this calculation problem thing is true, which I've never heard of. Wouldn't that apply to large firms as well? Wouldn't they have an internal calculation problem? How do they deal with that? So I asked him, I'm like, are you aware of a 1937 paper by Ronald Coase that asks and answers that question? Have you ever heard of it? I mentioned the title, and he said he hadn't. And then I asked the entire room, have any of you ever heard of this paper? No one has. So for those who don't know, Coase in 1937 wrote an economic theory of the firm where he answers that question. He says that transaction costs explain why we're not all independent contractors and why hierarchy is useful and can be efficient. But as hierarchies get to be larger, you get internal calculation problems. And so you have two different cost curves that are intersecting, and that tells you the optimal size of a firm. None of them had heard of that. And I found it utterly perplexing because I thought these are a bunch of people that have strong opinions about the justice of employment, the nature of the firm, the nature of whether we should have economic democracy or not. But none of them know the most fundamental theory about why hierarchy exists in the first place or why firms exist in the first place. So it would seem like, imagine being a philosopher of physics who doesn't actually know any physics. You probably don't have a very smart opinion. I think similarly, if you're a philosopher who works on justice, but you don't actually understand how any of the institutions you're talking about work and why they do what they do, you're probably going to have pretty dumb opinions about that stuff. So there are philosophers who think all my job is to do is to rank all possible states of the world from better and for worse. And then I simply hand that ranking over to economists like you, and you tell me what's the most feasible thing, how high up on this utility curve we can get. But that's not my concern. In reality, though, the people who try to do that, what they end up doing is sneaking in a bunch of mistaken social scientific assumptions, and they end up philosophizing the way that they do because they don't understand the world. So I think at the very least, before you go and ask, is it just that people live in families? You should probably find out why families exist. Before you ask questions like, is it just that we use money as a medium of exchange? You should probably understand how money functions and what it's doing. Before you ask, is it just to have a government or not? You should probably learn why governments exist and what they do and what they can't do. But for some reason, a lot of philosophers think that's unimportant.
Yeah, actually, so our institute is based upon Juan de Lugo, this famous scholastic philosopher of the 16th century, and it's interesting that, and it's not only Rothbard that says it in his History of Economic Thought, but also Schumpeter, Raymond de Rouver, that they were the first, or at least the major, the first systematic economists before the 18th century economists, and they were interested first of all in talking about justice-related topics, the just price, whether interest usury was should be allowed or not, and they realized that before answering these questions, they had to know what a price was and how it emerged, what supply and demand. So I think it's very important. I see that in your work you stress a lot, and it's obviously related to your understanding of democracy, the contributions both of the Austrian school, Hayek and Mises, and also and especially of the public choice school. How did they impact you? And am I correct in my analysis?
I think I've been more influenced by the public choice people than by the Austrians. I certainly have read a tremendous amount of Hayek. I agree with quite a bit of what he says, and but I think my kind of training when I was an economics major was kind of your standard sort of neoclassical economics. And so quite a bit of what the Austrians have said has been integrated in some certain parts of price theory, points about calculation, points about entrepreneurship. So I think I wouldn't say I think of myself as someone who's like friendly to Austrian economists, but I don't think of myself as like an Austrian economist per se. I think I'm just sort of a mainstream person. In contrast, I think when it comes to the public choice sphere, it's all public choice fundamentally is applying microeconomics consistently. So this sounds like a really cartoony thing to say, but it's true. It's unfortunate that I have to even say this. Many people have this bifurcated view of human nature where they think in the market, people are predominantly selfish and rational and self-interested. And then when you put them into a political sphere, if you put a crown on somebody's head, or if you give him a machine gun, or if you give him access to $6 trillion worth of the federal budget of the United States, this magically transforms them into a selfless, altruistic saint. Obviously, that's not true. So all public choice really is thinking people are people. We're going to start with the assumption that their behavior, their incentives, their way of reacting to the world is going to be fairly uniform across context, unless we have evidence to the contrary. And then we're going to apply that insight. And then when you start applying public choice consistently, you realize that inside of collective activities, we frequently have perverse incentives where even though the activity might have some sort of public or noble purpose, the people who work within that don't necessarily share that purpose. They might pay lip service to it, but they actually have they actually have incentives to do things that serve themselves, and they'll do so. And you can make predictions about people's behavior in light of that. You can test those predictions, and they turn out to be very strongly predictive. An example, like a very simple example, would be this. So say at Georgetown University, if you are a tenure track faculty member, I'm not sure how that translates. I don't know enough about the Spanish educational system to know if you have these distinctions. But we have faculty who are eligible for something called tenure, and we have faculty that are not. The ones who are eligible for tenure are overwhelmingly, at research universities like mine, paid to do research. All the incentives are based on that. For instance, when you get a raise, 60% of that raise is determined by research, only a small percent by teaching. If you get tenure, it's almost entirely determined by your research and not by teaching. On the other hand, we have faculty that are basically paid to be good teachers. 80% of their raise is determined by their teaching scores. Unsurprisingly, what you find is that the teaching awards at my university almost always go to the teaching professors. One, because they put more effort into teaching, but two, they also put more effort into convincing their students to nominate them for those teaching awards. So, and in contrast, the research faculty have a strong tendency to prep a course once and try to do that course over and over again exactly the same way and minimize the amount of time they spend on teaching, because that's where the financial rewards are. It's when you look at our behavior, it makes sense. It's because of our incentive structure. It's not, we might pay lip service to other kinds of goals, but our actual behavior follows where the incentives push us to do.
And this sort of behavioral symmetry, right, that the public choice school stresses, did it have also an impact on you upon looking into the legitimacy, for example, of or not legitimacy, so to speak, but you talk about the viewing democracy, for example, or government in general, from an instrumental point of view? Does it actually deliver, right, the best outcomes and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. One striking feature for me, there's a subfield of philosophy that's called democratic theory. That's like philosophers who talk about the value and justification of democracy and what even counts as real democracy and so on. And when I started reading that stuff, at first I was just flabbergasted and completely annoyed by it because it seemed irrelevant. I mean, it literally seemed like they weren't talking about any actual governments in the world. So I think, without naming names, I think many times I read arguments that philosophers write in favor of democracy, and I say, if you are right, this doesn't justify the government of Spain. It doesn't justify the government of the United States or of Canada or the United Kingdom or France. It has nothing to do with any of these actual governments. What you're telling me is that democracy would be justified if it behaved a certain way that it doesn't actually behave in practice, if it was structured the way it wasn't structured in practice. So you haven't justified any actual governments to me. And I don't mean in the sense of you're saying, well, they're just like poor, I've sort of explained what an ideal government would be, and these things are kind of like poor proxies, so they're not good enough. I'm like, no, you haven't even done that. You haven't justified them at all. You haven't shown me any reason to believe in it. So it seemed like a lot of these papers were written ignorant of what political scientists and economists and sociologists had to say, or political psychologists had to say about how democracy actually works or functions. And if they did cite something empirical, they would usually cherry pick. Like there might be 90 studies trying to test whether deliberation of a certain sort makes people behave better when they vote. And 89 of them would say it doesn't, and one would say that it does. So they would just pick that one study and cite that. And so I found this really irritating, but then I realized this is actually a good reason to work on that topic rather than to ignore it, which is what I originally did. It's kind of like the same thing where we're all familiar with the "that's not real socialism" problem. How it works is like when a new socialist state arises, when the dictator takes over, he'll start giving a little bit of money to the poor, and all the socialists will say, see, that's real socialism. Look at how wonderful it is. And then 3 years later, when in fact the country starts going bankrupt and people don't have enough to eat and the dictator starts killing off all of his adversaries, they go, well, that wasn't real socialism. Real socialism's never been tried because by definition, real socialism is people being nice and good things happening. You get something kind of like that with democracy, where whenever you complain about democracy, they say that's not real democracy. That's the problem with it. And part of me is like, that's fine. I'm not interested in talking about real democracy, where real democracy turns out to be an imaginary fiction. What I'm interested in talking about is unreal democracy, where unreal democracy is the stuff that's actually in the world, right? And I want to know, are these governments justified? Should we do better? What should we actually do given how human beings are capable of behaving?
Right, and I think that's extremely not only interesting but important nowadays, as you said, right? Everybody thinks he's a Democrat. Nobody from the left or the right, they all agree more or less, at least in my country or in Spain, they have this idea of democracy. In your book, you make it clear that there are two approaches, so to speak. I kind of mentioned it just a second ago, but one is to view democracy or to justify it from a procedural way, so based on the mechanisms of decision making, to make it brief, and the other one is the instrumental way. What is your view on these two issues, and why do you come out on the instrumental part in the end?
Yeah, good. These words, they're difficult words because they're easily confused with other things. But basically, the idea behind what's called proceduralism or procedural defense of democracy is that democracy is good in and of itself because of the way it makes decisions. And you don't have to know how good the decisions are. You don't have to know if the decisions work. Just the fact that we made the decision this way is enough to justify the decision. Or at least has some sort of weight or bearing on whether we should go along with it. So an example of this would be something like if you and I were splitting a cake, like imagine we have like a slice of cake and we have to decide to split it. Someone might say, well, here's what we should do. You cut and I choose, or I cut and you choose. Like I cut the cake in half. I can cut the cake however I want, but then you get to pick whichever piece you want. And people would say that's a procedure which ends up being fair. And it doesn't matter as long as we follow that procedure. However, the cake gets distributed, it's totally fine because I chose to cut it a certain way, but I allowed you to make the first choice about which piece you get. So if you end up getting 99% of the cake, that's my fault for cutting it that way. So some people say democracy is supposed to be like that. The fact that we choose as equals to make a decision is enough to say the decision is right and justified and enforceable, regardless of the content of that decision. Instrumentalism, on the other hand, is the view that what justifies political decision, any particular kind of political decision-making process, theocracy versus democracy versus pure democracy versus Republican democracy versus, whatever other fascism or anything else is, what decisions do they actually make? And that could include things like how well do they respect people's rights? How well do they recognize people and treat them as equals in other respects? How well do people live in that country? How well is justice administered when it comes to, say, criminal justice, et cetera? So most people probably have a mix of those things, but philosophers often go towards the pure proceduralist view where they're like, as long as we do democracy the right way, whatever we do is good. And I think on its face, it's an absurd view. I honestly don't think anyone can seriously think that because you can just come up with clear examples. Imagine the United States, you, the reader, come up with your idea of the best, the listener, your idea of what the best possible way to run democracy is. Maybe we all debate and deliberate with one another and we share ideas and there's no influence of money and everyone's an equal and whatever it might be, you add that in. And imagine that after we do all this deliberation, we unanimously agree in the United States that we're going to drop nuclear bombs on the tiny island nation state of Tuvalu. That's evil. And if you have a view where you say, well, my theory says that that's okay because you decided it the right way, I'm like, well, then your theory's dumb and you should stop believing it. That's just a clear counterexample to your theory. Other things that people say are things like, well, democracy is inherently good because it's fair. It's the fair and equal system. And then I respond by going, no, it's not really. If you actually cared about fairness, you wouldn't do anything like a voting system. The reality is in every country, when you have votes and you vote for office, it's going to be biased towards people who are good looking, people who are charismatic, people who are good at manipulating other people who are good at speaking, people who have connections. In generally speaking, the ethnic majority will have more power than the ethnic minority. The religious majority will have more power than the religious minority. In every actual democracy, what you'll find when you give everyone equal voting power is that what are called persistent minorities never have any say, right? So for instance, I'm a persistent minority on certain ideological issues. I strongly favor open borders. I think it should be as easy for me to move to Spain as it is for me to move to Maryland. And I think it should be as easy for someone to Spain to move to where I live as it is for them to move from Madrid to Barcelona. I think it should just be a piece of cake. You can just do it at will. That's a very clear minority position. It has no traction in our politics. I'll always get outvoted between people who think we should have almost entirely closed borders to people who think we should also have almost entirely closed borders that are ever so slightly more open. That's the debate in the United States. 99.9% closed or 99.8% closed. So I get outvoted every single time. If we actually cared about equality, what we would do is say, we wouldn't want to have these persistent minorities who are always outvoted. What we would do is say something like this: we'll have a lottery system. Who's going to be president? Well, we had a lottery among all adults, and congratulations, Aunt Becky, you're now the president. Now we'll have a lottery. The vice president turns out to be, some like random 19-year-old surfer dude from Hawaii. And now we're going to figure out who the Speaker of the House is. We had another lottery, and that turns out to be this person. Or alternatively, what you could do is you could have everyone vote, and then you assign percentages, a percent chance of winning based upon how many people voted for what. You roll some dice, and it turns out, okay, 5% of people voted for the far left-wing Communist Party. We rolled the dice. It came out to be 4, so the Communist Party gets to rule. That's what we would do if we actually cared about equality and fairness. There's no bias towards money. There's no bias towards sex or gender or, other kinds of unfair factors. When you mention this to people, basically no one is willing to support it. And their reasoning is, they say, but if we did that, there's a chance that we'd actually have a legitimate fascist or a legitimate like neo-Stalinist communist as the president, or we'd have people that are just completely and totally incompetent who would be president. We can't have that. And I go, oh, okay, you're right. We can't for that reason. But the fact that you responded that way proves that you don't think equality and fairness are the only values. You also think the quality of the decisions and the quality of the policies matter as independent values too. So I think very few people are actually pure proceduralists when you push them. When you give them these kinds of arguments, they quickly back off from it, and they realize that no, the quality of decision making matters too. It's not simply a matter that is fair and equal.
And you mentioned other kinds of. You mentioned Habermas, for example, as the purest of the proceduralists. But there's also this idea that you also point out in your book, that some people defend democracy based on as if it were a poem, you say, or as a symbolic aspect to it. What's wrong with that? What?
Yeah, those are two good. I want to start with, you mentioned Habermas, and I want to say something about him that people miss all the time. When people read my book, they go, I spend the first couple of chapters explaining how bad people are at politics. I argue that politics makes us stupid and mean. It makes us bad. We think very bad. We know very little about politics. We're very bad at thinking about it, and we're very cruel to other people with whom we think we disagree. I think politics is very bad for our character, and we practice it badly. So people look at me and they go, Brennan, he just thinks that people are really dumb when it comes to politics, unlike Habermas. But actually, no. The funny thing about deliberative Democrats like Habermas is that Habermas also looks at the actual democratic discourse and says, this is terrible. When people are reasoning and debating, they're not acting on real reasons. They're not really informed. They don't really understand one another. So deliberative Democrats like Habermas actually have very high standards, extremely high standards for what counts as proper rational discourse in politics. And all actual democracies fall very far below those standards. So that's the difference. Like Habermas looks at democracy and says, this is a total mess. Like actual democracy, which again aren't real democracies, but the actual democracies in the real world, this is a total mess and people are behaving horribly. And then he responds, what they need to do is do democracy the right way. I look at it and say, this is a mess. People are behaving horribly. I don't think we can get them to do democracy the right way that Habermas thinks we should. So I think we should try to fix it other ways. So it's worth noting, just, a lot of times when people like take Habermas or Joshua Cohen or these other deliberative Democrats, they think they're people who really love democracy. But in fact, they're very, very critical of all actual democratic systems because they all fall far short of their goals. Now, that said, the second part of your question was about, actually, go ahead and remind me. I'm sorry.
Oh, that some people defend the democracy, not so much as it's an end in itself, but because it's connected towards symbolic.
Symbolic values.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you often see, I have a whole chapter on this in the book. You often see people make these arguments to the effect that democracy is a way of symbolizing that people are equal, right? Which is different from saying gives them equal power. It's a way of expressing the idea that everyone is equal. Or if we don't have democracy, we're expressing that some people are better than others. So take like Plato and Aristotle. Both Plato and Aristotle believed in natural hierarchy. They believe that some people are more valuable than other people. Some people are more fit to rule by other people, really partly by education and partly by birth. So for Plato and Aristotle, the idea of having some people rule over others just seems reasonable because they just think some people are naturally more fit. Most people nowadays don't think that. I don't think that. They think that fundamentally people are on some sort of moral, even if we're not all equally morally good or equally morally smart, no one has any natural authority over other people. And so this brings up a problem with politics, which is, well, why should we have any kind of political system at all? Don't we in politics always create a system in which some people end up ruling others? But the problem is that no one really has any right to rule. And democracy is supposed to be a way of saying, maybe if we have everyone have equal power to start and then we vote and deliberate, then in the end, even though some people tell you what to do and you didn't get to tell them what to do, you're still really an equal part of that system, so you can't really complain about it. So they often say things like, well, the nice thing about democracy is it's a way of saying everyone is equal in this fundamental sense. But I worry about that because I'm not sure if that's the right kind of justification for democracy. I say it's not a poem. Like, if we want to express the idea that all human beings are equal, there's lots of things we could do. We could have a statue of equality right next to our statues of liberty, right? We could have a national equality day where we get the day off and we all spend the time on equality-based exercises where we talk about how equal we are and do that. We could pick whatever. Actually, one thing we could do is pick whatever form of government delivers the most equal outcomes. It could turn out that if we actually care about, like, imagine you're like an income egalitarian, you think people should have equal income. It could turn out the way that you get that is by making you dictator. So you have more political power than anybody else, but the result is that we're all actually more equal. Having equal input does not guarantee equal output. That's well known. I also just wonder, like, well, why do we have to imbue the right to vote with so much power, symbolic power? So I think it's true in most countries, the right to vote is used in an expressive fashion. What countries do is when a group that was previously excluded, people start thinking of them as being valuable and on par, they extend the right to vote to them. So many countries excluded women, they excluded people who didn't have property, they excluded minorities, they excluded religious groups. You weren't allowed to vote because you are seen as a second-class, inferior group of people. And then as these countries become more liberal and tolerant, they raise the status of those groups, and along the way, they give them the right to vote. And it's like a public affirmation that you are equal to us. Similarly, many countries do something where they'll, in order to give you basically the middle finger, in order to say that we don't respect you, we take away the right to vote. In many countries, you remove, like if you commit a very severe criminal offense, they might remove your right to vote. You no longer get to vote. And that's a way of the country saying, you're not really a full member of our society anymore. You have been demoted because of what you've done. And of course, most countries don't allow resident aliens the right to vote. Most countries don't allow children the right to vote. They might not allow people who are severely mentally infirm to vote. Perhaps like very elderly people might lose the right to vote because of mental infirmity and so on. So these are like symbolic ways of saying you're not a full equal. So as a matter of fact, we do imbue the right to vote with all this symbolic power. But that's, to me, that looks kind of like saying there's this thing, voting, and we collectively have just attached meaning to it, which we don't have to. As an analogy, you can think of like, when I give up the thumbs up in the United States, this means like, hey, good job or excellent. It's like an affirmation. But there are parts of the world where if I do this is equivalent to sticking up my middle finger, and this is actually a sign of contempt. There's nothing built into my hand that makes it respectful or contemptuous. It's meaning that we impose upon the gesture. So in the book, I say, I want you to imagine something like, imagine a society where at age 18, you get a red scarf from the government. They send you this neck piece and everyone wears it outside. You become a legal adult, you get this red scarf and you wear it everywhere. And this red scarf is the society's way of saying you're an equal. In the past, it only gave it to white male property owners, but now every adult gets it. However, if you're a felon, you might lose it. Now imagine like a new right-wing party comes to power. And they're against homosexuals. So when they come to power, the first thing they do is they pass a law saying that gay people don't get the red scarf. In that society, people would then march on the streets and say, we demand that gay people receive the scarf. It's completely unfair. It's unjust. The fact that they don't get the scarf is a public way of humiliating them and saying that they're lower, second class and inferior. That all makes sense to us. But then when we tell it as a story, but we also recognize that there's nothing actually about the red scarf that signals equality. It's a meaning you're attaching to it. So I similarly say, we're attaching this meaning to the right to vote, but we have to ask whether it's a useful social construct to do that. So just to give a silly example, so if I stick up my middle finger, right, that expresses contempt, but we can just opt out of that right now. Maybe you don't want to for your viewers. I don't know. It depends on which class we're in. We could just decide, okay, in the context of this discussion, when I stick up my middle finger, it's no longer going to mean a nasty expletive or contempt. It's actually going to mean I respect you and hope you have a good life. So we've decided that we're just going to change the meaning of it. Now we have no reason to do that, right? However, we could learn that maybe, imagine we discovered that when you stick up your middle finger, for some reason, because of weird laws of physics, that cures cancer. Well, then we'd have reason to change the meaning structure we associate with it. Suppose we discover that when you say to somebody in English or in Spanish, I respect you, that the sound of the word respect, right, causes cancer. We would have reason to change the meaning of our language. That sounds dumb because these are abstract examples, but they're real life examples of this kind of thing. The Foray tribe of Papua New Guinea had the practice of eating the brains of their dead as a way of symbolizing respect and the existence of those people beyond death and the permanence of them through their families. It's kind of a beautiful ritual, even if it sounds a little disgusting to people. They had real meaning behind it that made it kind of beautiful. However, it also causes a nasty disease that kills people. I think the disease is called Kuru. So when they discovered that it caused this disease, they stopped using this practice. They changed this symbolism that they associated with funerals because the way that they were symbolizing respect was actually killing people. So I think similarly, we have to ask, if the way that we have as Western societies have chosen to symbolize respect is by giving everyone an equal right to vote or taking away the right to vote to people that we disrespect, is this actually a useful practice or is it a destructive practice? If it turns out to be a destructive practice, we should be willing to replace it with a better practice. But at the end of the day, there's nothing built into democracy that requires us to think that this is the only way that we can show that people are equal. Personally, I think what we should do, if we think that people are equal, it's more important to make good decisions that treat people as equals and have equal outcomes than it is to have equal input.
So more equal output as opposed to equal input, right?
Yeah, I mean, to give it a silly example, but that matters, it's a historically accurate example. Imagine you have a society that's 10% black and 90% white. Imagine all of the whites are completely and totally racist. They disagree about a whole bunch of stuff, but they all agree we want to hurt black people. Now imagine you have equal voting rights in that society. Every black voter gets one vote. Every white voter gets one vote. So everyone has equal input. They're all voting as equals. What would you expect to happen? Well, the 90% of the white people are always going to outvote the 10% of the black people. And the society will choose laws and rules which thwart and harm black interest and benefit white interest at their expense, despite having perfectly equal inputs. Even if you did the lottery thing that I was talking about, you just randomly pick one person and make that person president, you have a 90% chance of that person being a white racist who wants to hurt black people and a 10% of it being a black person. So again, perfect equality in that system, given those preferences, would result in black people being harmed. And you get unequal outcomes, illiberal, anti-liberal outcomes, because you have perfect equality going in. So if you actually care about equality, you can't simply care about the inputs, you have to care about the outputs. Now, that might vary from depending on your ideology. It might mean you think people have to have equal rights or equal opportunities. Maybe you think they should have equal income. Maybe you think they should have equal outcomes in some other respect. Those are things to debate, but it's worth noting that equal inputs not only doesn't guarantee equal outputs, it can actually be the mechanism which guarantees unequal outputs.
Yeah, and historically it has happened. I mean, people always come up with the example, right, that the Nazis came to power through a relatively equal democratic process. I would say. You use the example of treating democracy as a hammer, right?
Yes.
So you judge a hammer, right, as a medium, right, to achieve an end, whether it's a good hammer. If we find a better hammer, then we should go for it. And basically your book, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is trying to understand real world democracy, how it really works out, and whether there is an alternative. And then we can talk about your epistocratic alternative. How does, like, when you go into the real world and analyze, I know you bring out a lot of data work, based on the works of Brian Kaplan, Ilya Somin, and the like. How on issues of ignorance, incentives, irrationality. bias and so forth. How when we study real world democracy, what do we actually find out?
Yeah, good. Honestly, if there's one book to read, which I think does a great job summarizing how democracy actually works, it's a book called Democracy for Realists by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. I'm not sure if there's a Spanish translation. I'm trying to remember. I think there might be actually. It might even been translated by the same people that translated mine. So, anyways, we can look that up later. Here's a way of like summarizing it. Most of us are taught a theory about how democracy works in school, and the theory is wrong. We're usually taught this in like government funded like primary or secondary school. And the theory says something like this. Every human being starts off with a set of interests and concerns. They don't have to be purely selfish, but they have the things that they care about, values, right? It could be anything from I want the environment to be cleaner to I just think that we need less crime around here, or I wish I had a better job, any stuff that they care about. They then go and learn how the world works. They learn about what politics is able to do and not do, what the economy does, how human beings relate to each other. They learn sort of some social science in a way, even if they don't call it that. They learn how the world functions. On the basis of their values and their beliefs about how the world works, they form policy preferences, political preferences, perhaps even an ideology. So, for instance, maybe my mother-in-law and I both think that it's too bad that so many people aren't making enough money. She thinks that the minimum wage will give them more money. I think the minimum wage will give them less money and disemploy them. We both have the same values, but we disagree about how the economy works, and that might cause us to vote in different ways. So everyone's doing this. We all form our ideologies. And then the next step is we look around at the existing political parties and the existing candidates, and we pick the one that best corresponds to our political beliefs. Alternatively, if we recognize that the one that the best corresponds to our beliefs has a very low chance of winning, we might decide instead to vote for a more moderate party or more popular party that we like, but maybe not as much as our favorite choice. And at the same time, the parties want to win. So not only they're offering up policy platforms, but they're trying to figure out what can we do that'll make it so we'll actually get power. So they're modulating and changing their beliefs and their policies to try to appease a large percentage of voters. So the result of that is like when we go and vote, if not the majority, if not everybody, at least a very large segment of the population will select a party that will end up ruling because that party is giving them what they want. Then that party will come into power and try to do some of that stuff. A couple of years down the road, when there's the next election, the thought is we'll pay attention to what they did. If they broke their promises, we might vote them out. We might even vote them out if they kept their promises. If we asked them to do something and it turned out it didn't work, we might blame them and go, well, it didn't work, so we're going to hold it against you. We're going to vote for the other group now. We've changed our mind. So that's the thought. We have what democracy fundamentally is supposed to do is turn people's values into power. It's supposed to turn people's policy positions into power, converts the will of the people, or at least a large segment of the people, into power. And the thought is supposed to be something like, I know my own interests, you know your own interests. So for all kind of doing this, we'll get a political system that fundamentally responds to, if not everybody, at least a large number of people. If democracy worked that way, it would really be a great system. It wouldn't be perfect. There's still problems about minorities who get their interest ignored. But you can understand why, if that's how democracy works, people will be in favor of it. It's kind of like it's sort of an extension of the market mentality. You choose what you eat for dinner, I choose what I eat for dinner, and we're happy. We have these collective decisions where we can't just choose for ourselves, but if we at least let the majority choose for the majority, at least a large percentage of people will be happy, and it won't just be politicians doing whatever is good for themselves. So that's the story that we all learn. It's false. The problem with it is that's not true. Almost none of it is true. In fact, basically, here's how it really works. And this is what Aiken and Bartels say, and they give you the evidence for it. People do have the things that they care about. They do have values. They do have interests. The next step is supposed to be that they learn how the world works. They don't. Overwhelmingly, people know nothing about politics. They know almost nothing about almost any issue that you might think would be relevant for them to make a good vote. They don't know. For example, take like the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. Things you might think that would be useful for them to know are things like how much foreign investment comes in from the European Union into the UK. They don't know that. They're way off. We know we polled them. They don't know anything. What percentage of the UK is made up of European immigrants? They don't know that. What percentage of money comes in from, say, China? They vastly overestimated that. How much money does the UK send to the EU? How much are they getting back? They don't know any of that stuff. They're completely ignorant about that. It actually gets worse. In most countries, what you find is people don't know who their member of parliament is. They typically don't know which parties or party controls their parliament. They know basically nothing. And as long as we've been studying them, they don't know any of that. They know almost nothing relevant to politics. You might then think, okay, so how do they form an ideology? And the answer is they don't. It seems like they do, but they don't. There's a really good book called Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, which uses American data. That's by a guy named Donald Kinder and Nathan Calmo. And what they try to do is figure out what percentage of Americans have genuine policy preferences. Their estimate is like maybe like 15 out of 100, maybe 3 out of 20. It's really, really low number. What generally speaking happens is something like this. People look around and they go, something like this is what they might say. Like my people might say something like this. I'm from the Boston area of the United States. That's where I grew up, is right outside of Boston in the Northeast. So as a result of that, when it comes to sports, I root for all the Boston teams. Why do I do that? Well, because I grew up with it. Because if I root for the Boston teams, then the other people around me are like, oh, you're really one of us. You also love the New England Patriots. And you also love the Boston Red Sox. So you must really be a proper member of our society. We like you more. We're more likely to date you, befriend you, partner with you, etc. I get all these social benefits for being a member of that team. Similarly, like, it turns out that politics works like that too. For the most part, what people do is they look around and they go, okay, I have a sense of my own identity. I'm Boston Irish Catholic or something. So what do other Boston Irish Catholic people do? They vote Democrat. I'll vote Democrat. And then when you look at why particular identities are attached to particular parties, it turns out it's not really because the party has historically been very good for those people or done a lot to help them. It's usually a bunch of really weird random stuff. It's almost like it's effectively a random distribution. And then that's where most people stop. They don't even have political beliefs. You survey them and you ask them a question about a political issue, they'll give you an answer on the spot because they don't like to say, I don't know. But if you ask them that same question a month later, they'll give you a different answer. And if you ask them why they changed their mind, they'll say, I didn't change my mind. I've always thought this. So one political scientist named Converse is one of the first people to do these studies. He found that between 1958, 1960, 1962, and 1964, the correlation for the typical American between their professed political beliefs over every election was about 0. They're basically, when you survey them, they're giving you almost random answers. Maybe about 15 out of 100 people in a typical democracy has genuinely firm political beliefs where they're actually looking and voting for parties because they agree with them. Now, some people, if you ask them, they'll have a lot of political opinions, but what they're doing is not what you think. It's not, these are my political opinions and I picked that party because they match. Rather, it's, I'm voting for that party because that's what people like me do. I'm an artist, and we all know artists vote green. And if I tell the other artists I'm a member of the Green Party, they're going to like me more. But then some people do is they learn what the party thinks and they just parrot it. And if the party changes its mind, they change their mind too. They don't even realize that they have. They just copy whatever the party says. So it's not, I'm in favor of this tax policy, and that's why I vote green. It's rather the reason that I say I'm in favor of the tax policy is because I'm already voting green. The party makes me say this, not I picked the party because I agree with them. A nice example of this would be, say, in the United States with the Republican Party in 2016. Before Donald Trump was the presumptive nominee of the party, when you survey most Republicans, they said they were in favor of free trade, international free trade, which they should be because that's the right answer. If you're not in favor of free trade, you're economically illiterate, you should change. You're definitely wrong about that. You should feel bad about yourself too because the evidence is overwhelming. But all right, so most Republicans say they're in favor of free trade. But then when Donald Trump, who's a protectionist xenophobe, becomes looking like he's going to be the nominee of the party, in a very short period, about a month and a half, the Republicans switched from being pro-free trade to anti-free trade. Those same Republicans, when you survey them, you ask, why did you change your mind? They say, I've always thought this. What are you talking about? I didn't change my mind. So again, so here's what actually happens again. It's like we start with our values. We don't learn how the world works. We remain spectacularly ignorant of it. We get assigned to political parties on the basis of our identity and not on whether those parties promote our interests or not. Some of us rationalize that we agree with the party when we're just copying whatever they say. And a lot of us don't even bother to do that. Everyone votes. Elections are effectively random processes. A party comes to power, they do what they want. People aren't paying much attention to them, so they get away with doing a lot of whatever they feel like doing without getting punished by voters. And finally, if they do a bad job, do voters hold them accountable for doing a bad job? No, not really. They're not informed enough. So Zakin and Bartels say the typical voter has about a 6-month memory. They'll remember the economic performance of their country for about 6 months, and they'll blame the incumbents for that, even if the incumbents weren't really responsible, but they remember basically nothing else. And it's actually so bad that, like, let's imagine, like, if you were president, you do a really good job for 3.5 years and you make the economy get better and better. And then in the last 6 months, there's a recession and you end here. And imagine if I'd been president, I do a terrible job for 3.5 years, but in the last 6 months, there's an expansion. So we're going up and I end here. Overall, you did a better job than I did. But I'm more likely to be reelected than you because they remember that things were getting better for 6 months rather than how much overall growth there's been. So basically, democracy doesn't work. It doesn't work the way that you were told in grade school. Your theories of it are wrong. And so in order to evaluate whether we should have democracy or not, we have to have a realistic account of how it actually behaves.
It's interesting that you talk about, right, the hobbits, right, those that are really not really interested, so to speak, that they go on with their lives. Maybe they have some views, but they do not really back them up with evidence, or really are interested in right, explaining, right, what they actually think. And then there's the hooligans, which are actually the majority, right, and what democracy does is mostly, as Schumpeter, right, said, transforms the hobbits into hooligans. And you have this also among classical liberals, as you point out, or libertarians, that, you know, the Facebook type libertarians that, you know, they have already this image, they want to protect it, and they really do not care about the deeper philosophical issues. Then you propose an alternative, and other authors have also criticized democracy, maybe from a different view or from a similar one, and have advocated for, say, a smaller government, right? So in order to avoid all of these kind of issues, right, of these voter ignorance, voter irrationality, and so forth, what we should do is make the government smaller, so we minimize the losses, so to speak. Others maybe secession, so you make the government really smaller in terms of the size of the territory. Your idea is what you call epistocracy. What is it, and why why is it good for us to study it and go deeper into this issue?
Yeah, good. So one of the fundamental issues with democracy is that it incentivizes people to be ignorant. The fact that people are ignorant, it's not because they're stupid. It's an incentive problem. Your vote doesn't count for very much, and as a result, you don't have an incentive to be well informed with your vote, right? So if I'm going to drink this, and when I decide to drink it, I will actually put it in my body. So it's really important to me, and I pay close attention to whether this is Sprite Zero as opposed to some sort of arsenic. However, when I vote, regardless of how I vote, the same thing is going to happen. I have almost no chance of making a difference. So I'm free to use my vote to sort of, for symbolic purposes, to be ignorant when I vote and so on. And that's true of everybody. So what you basically have it's not something that voters are ignorant and irrational, but they are rationally ignorant and rationally irrational. It's in their self-interest to remain ignorant and to think in a not so careful way, or to vote recklessly. So that point is not original to me. People have been saying that since 1957 when this first started being studied. So what an epistocracy is meant to be is any kind of system where you have representative government, you have division of powers, you have all the other kinds of constitutional provisions you already have in a democracy. And I don't take a stance on things like, should we have a parliamentary system or a presidential system? I think we should have a parliamentary system, but I don't get into that in the book. Is it okay to have a constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom, or a constitutional monarchy like Spain, where the monarch actually has some real power, unlike in the UK, where they basically have no power? I don't get into that stuff. I'm just ignoring it for the purpose of this book. What an epistocracy does is it in some way weighs votes according to knowledge. So it comes from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge, and kratos, like power to the knowledgeable, as opposed to democracy, power of the people. So there's lots and lots of forms of epistocracy that I consider. Some of them are very objectionable. Some of them might work better than others. The one that people tend to focus on is the idea of, like, what if you only get the right to vote if you can pass a test? So in the same way that in most countries you only have the right to drive a car if you pass a test proving that you're competent to do so, What if you had to pass a test proving you're competent to vote before you're allowed to vote? That I think in principle that can be defended, but that really pisses people off, and they start thinking about all sorts of horrible counterexamples. And that's the thing that they attribute to me. The thing that I actually think is worth trying is what I now call it enlightened preference voting. I had a different name for it in the book, but I have a better name for it now. The way that enlightened preference voting works is like this. Everybody gets to vote, and you get to vote as an equal. In fact, because you get to vote as an equal, it's not even clear if this is technically epistocracy versus democracy. It's a real debate about what the word means, and I don't want to get into semantic debates. I don't really care. But when you vote, you do three things. So the first thing you do is you tell us who you are, your demographic categories, what your race is, your ethnicity, maybe what language you speak at home, your income level, whether you're employed or not, your educational level, where you live, your religiosity, if any, etc. Because these things affect people's votes. The second thing you do is you take a quiz of, say, 30 to 40 questions of very basic political knowledge. Can you identify which party controls parliament? Can you identify who the chief executive of your country is? Do you know some facts about, say, the unemployment rate? Do you know any facts about recent large bills that have been passed, et cetera? There might be all sorts of questions in there. Maybe it includes things like the price of milk. How much does milk cost, like on average in the country? Whatever, it could be anything. So you have basically who people are and what they know. And the third thing you do is you ask them what they want. Whatever it is you're voting on, if it's a referendum, like should we leave the EU, their opinion, or which party should rule, their opinion, whatever's being voted on, you ask them that. So now when you have these things, you do this for everybody, and you effectively get three sets of data: who people are, like who the people are, what the people know, and what the people tend to want. When you have these three sets of data, you can then statistically estimate what would a demographically identical country have voted for if they were fully informed. Right? We can simulate what would a country that looks exactly like ours, is exactly the same kinds of people in it, have voted for if only they had gotten a perfect score on the quiz. In fact, they'll probably get a really low score. The average score on the quiz is going to be a failing grade. But what if I waved a magic wand and made it so that a demographically identical country had gotten to vote on this thing, but they knew the answers to all those questions? What would they have supported? So in a way, it's a way of simulating what an informed public would have supported without actually making the public informed. At the end of the day, no one really has more power than others. And by the way, you can let anyone vote. You can let cats and dogs and small children vote on this. It won't hurt the results. It's totally fine, because the quiz thing affects it. It removes bias. So people worry about like bias that's being introduced by income or race or something. It's correcting for that. So what it does is it's like a way of extracting wisdom from the crowds. What would the United Kingdom have voted for in Brexit if only it had known the facts? In fact, the British people were massively misinformed. Both the Remain and the Leave voters were completely misinformed about all the pertinent and relevant facts. What would they have supported if only they'd been well informed? Well, we can use this method to figure that out. In fact, this kind of method is what political scientists and economists right now use when we want to know things like, how does race affect voting? How does income affect voting? How does knowledge affect voting? So instead of using it simply as a research method, what if we used it as a method for making better collective decisions? It'd be nice if I could wave my magic wand and make Spain perfectly informed about politics. Any Democrat would want me to do that. Habermas would want me to do that. He would think it would lead to better outcomes. Right. So we don't have any kind of magic wand like that. We don't have any really good way of making people better informed. But the next best thing is if we could get what democracy would have done if the people were better informed. We can do that with this kind of method.
Just to be a devil's advocate and try to see if here, let's suppose that on this quiz, so one answers who you are and so, but most voters somehow, or at least all those who vote somehow are very knowledgeable and not only knowledgeable in general, but they know everything about politics and they have, so to speak, the bigger say on political issues. Yet they have the Keynesian mindset, right? They think how do we, like, through an epistocratic system, how do we minimize the costs of people who are knowledgeable making decisions, but yet, I mean, these are difficult topics that within academia as well are very much in dispute, right? So how can one objectively so to speak, say, well, this is wrong or this is right?
Right. I mean, in a way, we can't really. It's not like, I mean, my actual view is like we should do whatever is objectively right. And so if it turns out that like whatever the correct economic policy is, independent of anyone's belief, that's what we should do. But we don't have any mechanism for actually doing that, right? We can't just ask God, like, well, what's the best policy, right? We have to use human beings that are flawed to make decisions. So it is true that this system does not guarantee that you get the right result. It might turn out that by luck, ignorant people have landed on the right answer and informed people have the wrong answer. And by the way, this is not, just to be clear, this system is not saying what we do is we take all the really well-informed people or people with university degrees, and they're the ones that get to vote and everyone else gets excluded. It's not doing that. It's a totally different idea. It's just saying we simulate what would a demographically identical populace have voted for had it been informed. It might turn out that when you do that, you get bad answers, answers that can be demonstrated to be wrong or that later turn out to be mistaken. However, the point here is it's much more likely we're going to get good decisions by doing it this way than it is by asking the actual uninformed populace. You know, that's the idea. It's like it's more likely we'll get a good decision than a bad decision. And we also have like external evidence of it working because of this being a research method that people have used before. So one of the funny things about this is this enlightened preference voting idea as a method for studying what people would think. Lots and lots of different political scientists and economists and others have used it to study voter behavior. These economists and political scientists often disagree about politics, but they get and they use different data sets, they ask different questions, but they get fairly uniform results, which end up, by the way, cohering with a lot of like the low-hanging fruit of economics. So you find things like, in general, when using the enlightened preference method, you find that people favor less expansionary governmental system. They don't favor quite as much government regulation of the economy. That doesn't mean they become libertarian or anarchist, but they favor pared down, better regulations that would pass cost-benefit analysis. They favor typically increasing taxes to offset deficits rather than having a lot of deficit spending. They favor kind of nuanced positions on environmental issues. They tend to favor free trade, more immigration. They're more in favor of gay rights and a number of other. They're more civil libertarian. They're less pugilistic and warlike. Even if you look at voters if you do this method and just look at people within a single party, you find radical differences. So high information Democrats have completely different policy preferences when they have them at all, from low information Democrats, etc. And you find that the thing that emerges doesn't correspond to any particular political party. So it doesn't look like it's biased towards one party or another. So I think this is independent evidence that it's likely to lead to better decisions than what we currently have. I definitely don't say it will perfect things. For one thing, it doesn't make the people any more informed. It doesn't correct for the fact that people are biased and nasty towards people with whom they disagree and so on. It doesn't do any of that. It's not actually fixing the people. It's just an attempt to be like, given how bad the people are, can we sort of make decisions as if we were better?
Right.
Yeah. So for me, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better. Right. Because my view, ultimately, you mentioned the thing about a hammer. My view is democracy, it's a tool. It turns out so far of the political systems that we've tried, democracy is the best tool. It does a better job delivering the goods than any other system that we know about. That doesn't mean pure democracy does, because what actually delivers the goods the most are limited republican democracies that have very strong liberal constitutions and actually limit the amount that democracy itself gets to do in politics. They have rules for experts and judges and others. That's what works the best. But I think the only thing that justifies it is it's the best system we have. And if we can find a system that performs better at all, we are not only can feel free to use it, but we're obligated to do it. So if it turned out that making you dictator of the world outperformed democracy, I would totally be in favor of having you be dictator of the world. If it turned out that like putting policy positions on a dartboard and throwing darts produce better outcomes, better, fair, more free, etc., I'd be in favor of that. Realistically, they're not likely to, but this system enlightened preference voting is looking at the flaws of democracy that we know are there. What's something we could do that could try to mitigate those flaws and reduce the pain that they cause?
And for it's interesting that you mentioned that one might say, yes, you say let Becky be queen, right? If it's gonna improve matters. But then at one point in the book, you sort of dismiss the other alternatives like theocracy or aristocracy or monarchy. Maybe they are also better than democracy, or why do you think they? I mean, for example, I was reading the other day Friedman, who was a Democrat. I mean, Democrat in the sense that he believed that he was a Democrat in the Misesian sense, but he said maybe aristocrats wouldn't have the presumption that maybe a planning authority elected democratically might have. I don't know if you.
Yeah, it is a good question. Like overall, what does better than what? I mean, I think, for example, I don't like everything that Singapore does. I think they have weird drug policies and so on, but it's clear that they've been a very competent government. Whether they count as democratic is something that people hotly debate. Aristotle had this hypothesis in the Politics, 2,400 years ago, which I think has largely been supported by the evidence, though maybe not quite exactly, but I think he's probably about right. The thing about his view was something like this: having the rule of one person, the chances of it being really, really good are higher. Like the ability of like one person who's just a dictator to just do everything right they have a better chance of doing something really good, but the downside risk is really high. They have also a much, much higher chance of being a complete disaster. When he thought about like the rule of the few, like an aristocracy versus an oligarchy, he thought again, the aristocracy has a potential to do things really, really well. Maybe not as good as much as a dictator could, but then also if it's an oligarchy, they can be a disaster. And he thought that the rule of the many, whether in the good form, which he called constitutional government or a republic, or the bad form, which is what he called democracy. He used democracy as a pejorative word. He thought that it tended not to be very good, but it tended also not to be very bad. It was kind of like a middle of the road sort of thing. I suspect I think he's probably wrong about the exact ranking, but I think that a lot of those other systems, they're too dependent upon the particular person. And that's what makes them bad. If you have, a dictator and the dictator is me, because I'm a saint and I always do the right thing for the right reason all the time, and I know everything, wonderful things will happen and the world will be great. But then when I get replaced by the next dictator, it'll probably be someone like Stalin who'll make it a disaster. Democracy in representative government, what it does is it spreads power out, which makes it not as dependent upon particular people, which thus reduces the downside risk. So democracies, they often make really stupid decisions, but they tend not to make absolutely catastrophic decisions that often. But again, I don't even want to overstate that. I mean, when you think about, say, Germany becoming fascist, how did it do it? Well, basically through democratic means, right? So democracies do sometimes make really catastrophic decisions. I mean, I think the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, was a catastrophe, and that was decided democratically. So I don't want to overstate how good democracy is or understate the downsides. But I think, nevertheless, the rule of the few in practice has had even bigger downsides than democracy has. So part of the reason we pick democracy over other systems in practice is that it's less disastrous when things go really bad. The epistocracy thing that I'm talking about, it retains the features of democracy that prevent massive disasters. So I think it would likely perform better overall.
Interesting. Well, I thank you very much for your time. It's really been very, very interesting, and I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it, and they have a lot of work to do now on looking more in depth into your work and into the epistocratic alternative. So really, thank you very much for this great opportunity, Professor Brennan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Y muchas gracias a todos los que nos han escuchado. Espero que os haya gustado la entrevista y, como les he dicho, pues les ruego a todo el mundo de que lean a Contra la Democracia del profesor Brennan y que aprenden más sobre estos temas. Muchas gracias.